This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, MICHAEL COVEL. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. So we know, going back in history, the term, the phrase, the Silk Road. Well, today there is a new digital Silk Road. Guess who's running that baby? China. China is wiring the world. China is laying the infrastructure. My guest today, Jonathan Hillman, an expert on U.S.-China relations, he puts down the urgent warning shot that we all better pay attention. Now, who knows? Maybe it won't be such a bad thing if China's running it all. I've been to China. Okay, there's pros and cons to China. But guess what? There's pros and cons to America. I can look around the world right now, and I can see Western democracies beating the hell out of people. So don't try and tell me that everybody's good or everybody's bad. There's shades of gray. But I love jumping into these conversations to get under the hood, to find out what's really going on. Jonathan Hillman takes us on the inside perspective as China lays down their digital Silk Road. I hope you enjoy this conversation. Let me give my best, very quick and dirty synopsis, and we're, of course, going to break this down more as we get going here. But essentially, China, and what you are affectionately calling the digital Silk Road, China is laying the digital pipe, so to speak, the network across the world, especially in developing countries that don't have the money. And I'm sure there's all kinds of deals that are made for this, meaning the host country, let's say, could be a country in Africa, could be a country in Asia. They don't have the money. China comes in. They say, we'll do the job. We'll lay all the digital infrastructure. Of course, in turn, they have to give up something to China. And then ultimately, what could happen if China gets this plan, and the plan's going to be a lot more detailed than what I'm synopsizing right now, but they would have a lot of control because basically they'd be the network administrator. Now, you can correct me. I mean, obviously, you've got a whole book on it, so it could go a lot longer than that. But let's say that happens. What is the downside other than China just got a lot more rich and powerful at the expense of perhaps America, other Western countries? But beyond the competitive side of it, what is the real downside that, for example, the average American should be thinking about?
I don't want to overlook the competitive part of this because I do think that ultimately that comes back home. That scenario that you just laid out, I think results in jobs that are lost in the United States. I think it results in having less innovation and not being the attractive place that it's been for decades for people all around the world to come get an education and work and pursue opportunities. So I do think that that is a real risk. There's also a whole host of risks that go beyond, though, the economic and commercial implications. And to get an understanding for those, I think on the one hand, some of this isn't hypothetical anymore. I mean, we've seen the Chinese government's behavior in cyberspace. We've seen them steal billions of IP. We've seen them steal information on lots of Americans. And then we've also seen them threaten other countries in the economic domain with limiting tourism, using the connections that they already have with other countries for leverage. So I think we would see that same type of attempt to use leverage, in this case, through digital technology in order to get what they want. So that to me is not a sunny scenario, but it's also not so hypothetical so far in the future because we already see some bits and pieces of this unfolding.
Let's take the side of the Chinese government. Let's just say the Chinese people. They look across the pond and they see the power of Google, the power of Facebook, the power of Amazon, the power of Apple, the power of Twitter. They also can read the press clippings, and I've seen some of the memes that are quite clever coming out of China. For example, the dialogue is often, well, gosh, there's the state control of the internet inside China. And I've seen some Chinese memes where they say, well, hold on, isn't there quite a lot of control and censorship going on inside America right now? I think it's interesting in the sense that, yes, I can appreciate it as an American. The American perspective might be, well, gosh, the economic side, we want to win. The national interests of all countries are kind of like that. So I get that. But I really want to unpack this side of the equation when it comes to the digital abuses. And I'm wondering if it really is not an equal opportunity employer in the sense that it sure feels like to me as an American, those freedoms that I might have had, and I've spent half my life with the internet and half my life without the internet, but it sure seems like a lot of those freedoms that we talked about in the Supreme Court cases and all that going back in the day, those things seem to have disappeared.
I think there's a few differences between the US digital ecosystem and what China is offering and putting forward as an alternative. I think on the US side, the platforms are still by and large open to the point of allowing Chinese officials to participate on platforms like Twitter when they don't let their own citizens participate on those platforms. Someone from Chinese government or one of the state-run media outlets can go after people through those platforms. The idea that China would allow that sort of open access on its own, I think is tough to imagine. And I think the other thing that gets at some of the differences in approach here is there are some pretty Orwellian applications of technology in China. We haven't talked about it yet, but in the book, I get into smart cities, or what some of the Chinese companies refer to as safe cities, which include a heavy surveillance component.
Are you talking about Australia right now? I'm giving you a little bit of grief right there because right now, everything you just described, as far as I can tell, is unfolding in Australia.
You're talking about some of the restrictions on media.
I'm talking about right now, you've got the QR codes, times you can go out, you're being tracked by your phone. There's all kinds of COVID restrictions going on in Australia right now. Literally the same kinds of things. If somebody was to say, well, those are going on in China. This was ultimately my fear in terms of opening up this conversation. Is it sure seems like the Western world is on the trend line to adopt the very same things that we want to criticize China about.
I personally see China's actions, especially domestically, in an entirely different category. I mean, they're using AI-enabled facial recognition to do ethnic profiling. They have mandatory DNA collection, putting people in camps. So I think that there is some really extreme applications of this technology that we see playing out in China. And I think Australia and its response to a pandemic is in an entirely different category.
Do you think it's fair for people to even look at the two and try and compare? Now, I've seen a lot of strife online right now with Australia. And to me, it feels like once you open up Pandora's box and you take away those vaunted freedoms that we have in our liberal democracies, it sure feels not nice.
I think the common thread here, the common challenge is that we're all learning that these technologies, including the internet, were initially really overhyped by techno-optimists as basically being things that only lead to good outcomes. This is something that I think was gaining traction in the aftermath of the Cold War. The reality is that these technologies are tools and they can be applied very differently. And so it does really depend on domestic context and the environment in which these tools are being used, what kind of restrictions and safeguards are on them, or the lack thereof, who controls them, and what are their aims. I think we've now gone from a point to being entirely optimistic, overly optimistic about a lot of these technologies, to maybe being in some cases too pessimistic, almost defeatist. But I think the idea that you're pointing to a debate in Australia about how technology is used, and it gets to this point that it does depend on these domestic contexts.
I'll just give one more example, then I'm going to let you expand about what the full enchilada, so to speak, of what the digital Silk Road is, how China is implementing it, and with what countries as of right now. But I want to give one little side example also to make this very practical, because I'm sure most people have seen this. I still like to use Facebook, and I don't really post family pictures, stuff like that. I post interesting nuggets, and often with a political, economic, investment type bent. And especially during COVID, it's been a really interesting time to observe people and observe leaders, especially Western leaders, and what they're doing. And look, I can't post certain things without the Borg, so to speak, putting a disclaimer. Obviously, it's not a human. It's just an AI robot that's seeing me use a keyword, but then basically telling whoever's reading my stuff, and I should be able to be a guy that can just give my opinion. And if I'm not liked, they can turn me off. If I say something wrong, if I defame somebody, they can sue me. But now there's an automatic disclaimer that's added that says essentially what I'm saying is wrong. That's a slippery slope, because once you do that, what's next? And this is Facebook. This is the American liberal democracy. So I don't know if you want to comment on that, but that's alive and well right now. The filtering, YouTube is off the hook. If you say the wrong thing about the wrong drug, about the wrong view of anything to do with COVID, you're off YouTube.
We're at a point now where a lot of people recognize that there are some pretty real risks from disinformation. especially state-backed campaigns. I mean, we've seen this with Russia in particular in the United States.
I'm not Russia. I'm just Mike.
I know. But I think if you're trying to sift through a huge volume of activity and flag things, you're basically trying to give people who are seeing things a warning.
But who checks the people that are writing the warning labels?
Yeah, well, I think this is interesting. This is in the news recently with some of the internal studies that have been done within some of these companies. The results haven't been followed. And so I think that you're right to point out that this approach is somewhat crude and it makes mistakes.
You're a very smart guy. You're being diplomatic there in the sense that you're saying they're crude tools and they're making mistakes, whereas, and I'm going to push you a little bit here, you would very easily say another country, for example, China, is more in despotic terms. It's more in a negative light. You're giving the positive light to it. Whereas from a free speech standpoint, I don't think there's anything positive I can give to Facebook or YouTube's actions at all.
Look, I haven't gone through all of your social media activity.
But it's not about me. I'm saying what's happening to me is happening to millions upon millions of people, if not billions. I'm just laying out, this gets back to my original point. The scenario is such that China's going down this path, and I'm going to let you, again, get into more of the bricks and mortar and the facts of what they're doing. But if they're going down this path, I want to, before I make them the boogeyman, also look at my side. I don't think I'm alone in being unnerved right now about what I'm seeing in liberal democracies.
I think this is a response to something that has also threatened liberal democracy. I think referencing Russia's attempts to meddle in U.S. elections, the outright lies that a former president of the United States would use using some of these platforms to push them to undermine the credibility of an election. Those are real threats to democracy as well. And so I see room here for a more thoughtful response. I think it's clear listening to your personal experience here is that response isn't intelligent enough yet. It's not effective. It's having some unintended consequences. But I'm not sure that the solution is to just go no holds barred because we've been there and that there are some real risks to that as well.
I will, again, as before I let you get into it, but you brought it up, not as a defender, but just to point it out that I understand people didn't like certain things that the former president said. But on the flip side, we did see our social media companies go ahead and remove the ability for a former president to speak. There's two sides to this. Somebody can say, well, gosh, he said something bad. That opens up a can of worms too. But then what about, well, we're going to deep six a former president of the United States of America who can no longer speak? That alone opens up a Pandora's box because who are the people that are making those decisions? Basically 5 or 6 leaders of the biggest media companies in the world. I know you can see where I'm coming from.
I'm not a lawyer and I haven't worked at any of those companies, but I think some of them have tried to experiment with these oversight boards with various degrees of success.
Let me phrase it to you this way. How does it make you feel? You're not going to offend me in any way, shape, or form. How does it make you feel? I'm not challenging you to discount anything that you've written about. It's a really interesting perspective and all kinds of things that I had no idea about, which we're about to get into. But how does it make you feel that I'm pushing on this? I detect that you feel a little bit like that. Am I wrong?
It depends on what part we're talking about here. I don't see restrictions on disinformation on U.S. platforms as being equivalent at all to what China's doing.
Okay. Maybe we'll circle back to some of the controversial stuff, but let you take the floor and explain to the audience from your perspective. So people are going to have to get into the book and really dive deep. But if you were to kind of lay out what China is doing, because from what I can read in your work, the rest of the world is not essentially, especially America, is not reaching out to the assorted developing countries. I can think about where I'm sitting today and I can imagine there's Myanmar, there's India, there's Pakistan across the pond there's Africa. That America is not thinking that it's a great opportunity to get all these folks online and connected and be essentially the network administrator. But China is. Why don't you explain what they're doing exactly?
Sure. So this is a set of activities that's part of Xi Jinping's signature foreign policy visions. So the Digital Silk Road is basically the technology dimension of the Belt and Road, which is his signature foreign policy vision. It has really emphasized partnering and making available financing to developing countries. So I think that there's been a recognition in the United States that there's both commercial and strategic implications of allowing a company like Huawei to dominate 5G. That sort of recognition has not yet taken hold about the stakes in the developing world. Even while the United States and some other mainly wealthy democracies are deciding to put some of China's tech companies under increased scrutiny. That same reaction is not happening in the developing world. I see really that's probably where the competition is headed. And if nothing is done, I think this is a really smart set of activities for Chinese companies to be pursuing. Many of them, Huawei included, in their early days, built their businesses by going into some of these riskier markets. And so in a way, they're dusting off that old playbook. But this is going to matter in the future because many of these places are where the world's population growth is expected. These markets are just going to figure much more prominently in the coming years.
You make an interesting point that I had not pondered. I guess I should have pondered it. But when we think about the quote internet and we think about all these ways that we are communicating globally these days, is that the infrastructure itself, people can talk about, it's in the cloud. Okay, you know what? The cloud is actually on the ground or it's a satellite, but somebody owns the infrastructure, whether it's all the warehouse drives somewhere or the satellites up in the sky. This infrastructure, look, we're still a world of countries and nation states. There's a certain sovereign aspect here. All this infrastructure is hosted somewhere. The control of that is what's really at stake, isn't it?
Yeah, this is something that I think that techno-optimism that used to be in forgot about. There was this idea that these technologies, the internet in particular, but I think extended to thinking about things like the fax machine in the early days, that these communications were going to be basically beyond the reach of states. And they were going to empower individuals much more so than they were going to empower states. But as you point out, at the end of the day, all of this does depend on physical infrastructure. And even the satellites are ultimately responsible to a sovereign country. The state has definitely not gone away. And we see in China's case, the state has actually used these tools or was using these tools to further cement its control.
When you start to, quote, lay down the digital pipes and all that kind of stuff, I assume, Africa is a place where they are putting severe resources into, correct?
One very rough estimate is that Huawei has built about 70% of the 4G networks across Africa. Some of that, a lot of it came with Chinese financing or benefiting from government subsidies to allow Huawei to put forward a really competitive offering. Those types of activities have this longer set of consequences because if you're a country with very limited resources, it's pretty easy to get locked into something like that. If you decide you want to upgrade your network, you're going to probably go back to your current vendor rather than ripping out the whole thing and replacing it. These are activities that are taking off in the developing world. There's a real demand for those investments too, especially after the pandemic. I think the pandemic really underscored that you don't want to be on the losing side of the digital divide. There's really a lot of demand for this.
I liked a phrasing that you use to describe the difference between how America is playing this game of connecting the world and how China is playing the game. And I'm going to let you explain what I'm about to say. USA, America is playing monopoly. China is playing risk.
And I think I also said something like the EU is playing red light, green light, which is the EU's using its regulatory power. The US is basically trying to remove barriers because it is the incumbent in some of these activities. And so it wants to give its companies the best opportunity to continue to be leaders. And then China is doing this set of activities in a way in which the state is playing a much larger role, in which I think security considerations figure even more prominently.
You bring up the EU. I think everyone has been to a website or whatnot where you get the message that says, we can't comply with assorted EU regulations. You can't see this content, something to that effect. I think that's what you're getting at with the regulation, isn't it?
Yeah, so GDPR, their data privacy regime, is a good example of this. Because the EU is such a large market, when they come out with a regulation, if you're a multinational company, it's often cheaper for you to kind of make that regulation your default rather than to have a separate set of activities to comply with that. But if you're not that multinational company, there can be costs associated with adhering to that. And so it sounds like you're pointing to a case in which someone probably didn't have the resources and decided, you know what, the demand isn't strong enough for us to do this.
Given your background and given to where you've gone with this book, and of course, I jump right into the fire at the beginning of this conversation, but you're right in the thick in terms of where you've written about all of the pertinent issues. They're all touching. The one comment that I saw here from a lot of the European countries, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit here, but they essentially are looking at America and saying, well, it sure looks like the U.S. political system is broken.
I think there was especially late last year prior to the election, but I think it sort of carried over a little bit. If you were to look at polling of EU perceptions of the US, it was kind of around Iraq levels of support, pretty low. I think a lot of feeling that the US was doing a lot of things unilaterally, and then also that it has domestic issues that it's not addressing head on. I do think that some of that has improved. I mean, the polling I've seen suggests it's improved slightly. I think the US is trying to do more collaboratively with the EU. I mean, just a week ago, there was a pretty big meeting in Pittsburgh among US and EU officials focused on trade and technology issues. I think that's an encouraging set of activities. But I think we should also, let's not have unrealistic expectations here about what's going to happen and be possible. I think there are real differences to work through. I also see some of those domestic challenges, especially on the investing in the US to make the US economy more competitive. I see that as being hopefully something that happens if we get this infrastructure package to move. I do think you're right. It was a dire situation last year, but I think there's some reasons to be a little bit more optimistic.
Part of my job here on an interview is to be the skeptic, to be the devil's advocate, and to take the other side. I think, I would guess, you are coming from a certain political persuasion. You're not positioning yourself as middle of the road. I'm guessing when you say that you're thinking the infrastructure bill it would be a good thing, because I think probably, obviously, half of America would say, well, we disagree. I would assume that you're taking a political position on that.
Polls I've seen suggest that much more than that simple majority support investing in infrastructure. I think that that's actually one of the biggest areas of bipartisan opportunity. I mean, there's disagreement within Congress over the specifics of it, but I think broadly speaking, the American public is pretty supportive of that.
Is this supportive of just the money spigot, you mean? I mean, I guess if you just have, give me money, let's build stuff. I guess people love that, right?
I think everyone has in their own life, they can think of projects that they interact with on a daily basis that need to be fixed. It doesn't take you that long to think about some bridge that should have been fixed 5 years ago. Or if you're living in some rural parts of the country, wouldn't it be nice to have fast, reliable internet? That's infrastructure too. And so I think that this is an issue that resonates. There's a lot of disagreement about the specifics among policy people, what to pay for and how to pay for it. But I do think there's an opportunity there.
Let me flip this around too. And I'll add one note real quick, because you were talking about infrastructure, the broadband increases in America. It immediately got me thinking, I'm only about a 6-hour flight away. It immediately got me thinking about the bullet trains in Japan and some of the bullet trains in China. Well, the bullet trains in Japan especially, I'm doubtful that anything in this infrastructure bill will ever give us something as concrete as the bullet trains in Japan, which are just spectacular if anyone's ever had a chance to go on it. I've been on bullet trains in China, and they're quite nice too. But I mean, Japan obviously does something special. Let me bring up China from a perspective. I can see and appreciate where you come from in your work. But, I've been to China many times. I'm guessing you've been to mainland many times as well, right?
I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to go back, but I have been there in the past.
It's impressive. For me, the first time I was in Beijing, first time I was in Shanghai, first time I was in Guangzhou, the first time I was in Shenzhen. It's impressive what they've done since 1979 to pull hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. And of course, okay, there's a lot of headlines right now about that maybe they're in a bubble, maybe they're not in a bubble. But you must feel impressed about a lot of what has taken place inside China. Okay, yes, I know in Western China, there is all kinds of controversy. You alluded to it at the beginning. But overall, I mean, when you're in those big cities and you're around, you've got to be impressed.
I think the progress, especially for people who have been there over an extended period of time, is pretty striking in terms of the physical infrastructure. I do think, though, that there are cases in which it's actually the infrastructure has been overbuilt. There's huge amounts of apartment housing with no one living in it. There also have been large road and rail projects of little to no commercial return. And China, I think, demonstrates really the far extreme of what you can do with infrastructure. There's definitely been also smart investment too, but they have these huge state-owned construction companies that China has 7 of the world's 10 largest construction companies. And many of them have basically built so much domestically now that they've almost run out of things to build. And that's been one of the drivers for this foreign activity. Xi Jinping talks these days about the importance of new infrastructure, which is basically digital infrastructure. So it'll be interesting as more companies respond to that. whether there's a similar set of excess capacity that's built up and whether that intensifies those activities for China. I think there's a pretty clear connection between domestic infrastructure capabilities and some of what we see in other countries.
The reason I brought it up and framed the cities like I've seen in a positive light is that I think most Americans, we get the message of everything is negative and that the government is this heavy hand and the people have no power and no control. Except when you're there, it doesn't feel like that exactly. It actually feels like an Asian version of America to me in many ways. Now, of course, there's more things behind the scenes, but look, there's a lot of things behind the scenes in America too. It's not pretty. There's not much that's done on the Capitol that is pretty. The sausage making in DC, there's nothing that's pretty. Frankly, most people in America have no idea how the sausage is made in Washington, DC. But I want to stay for a moment there on the negative versus the positive of China. What impresses you the most? Like, what does impress you the most? Because obviously there's a bunch of negatives and we've talked about some of them, but what does impress you the most?
Well, look, in the infrastructure space, which is what I've looked at for the last 5 years, tracking what China's doing, building projects in other countries, I think one of the positives is that infrastructure has really been elevated now as an issue that other countries like the United States are thinking about, not only in domestic terms, but in global terms. I think we see that in a whole set of recent developments, whether it's the G7 announcing in June this Build Back Better World partnership, which is going to include trying to expand financing for infrastructure in developing countries, whether it's the Quad summit. So the Quad is the United States, Australia, Japan, and India. They had a leader level summit recently and announced an infrastructure working group. I think those types of things wouldn't be happening if it weren't for China's activities in this space. The other positive is that if you're a developing country, this competition can be a good thing for you. It's good to have more options. That provides you with some bargaining power. Hopefully, it also provides you ultimately with a better decision about the option that you pick. All of that, I think, is hard to imagine without China providing this challenge and a reason to do more and be more competitive.
Clearly, in your situation and your background, the experiences you've had a chance to be in a lot of interesting circles. And I can imagine you've had coffee with a lot of interesting people. I'm not asking you to name drop, but I'm curious, all this great Rolodex you've been exposed to, all these interesting people. And now look, some of them might just say, well, okay, a lot of those folks could be politicians, they could be bureaucrats, whatnot. Okay, whatever. Do you have any, as we're in the middle of this China conversation, do you have unconventional views that your colleagues and other people, some of these circles, that they just say, oh man, Jonathan, I think you're wrong there. I mean, just like today, you've wanted to say I'm wrong a couple times, and we probably would have had a knockdown drag out over some of these issues. But I'm curious if there are any unconventional views you have about China that your colleagues would say, no, you've crossed the line.
It depends on which colleagues you talk to. But look, I work in an organization that is nonpartisan. And so I do have colleagues that disagree with me on these issues and other issues. And that's one of the really beneficial parts of being in a place like that, because I think it makes you revisit your own thinking. It makes you sharpen your arguments, and hopefully you're able to do the same for them. I think there's a few general perceptions in Washington, D.C. in particular of China that I've tried to correct in my past writing. One of them in particular, I think this is something that's maybe mostly common for people who are looking at China from the foreign policy, national security lens. I think there's a tendency sometimes to look at China as this monolith and to look at its actions and activities as being hyper-centralized and uber coordinated. While that can be true in some cases, some of what I saw when I was visiting Chinese infrastructure projects in different parts of the world was often a little more chaotic than I was expecting. And it was a little bit more opportunistic and disjointed and fragmented. I think that it's important to, even as we look at China's strengths and advantages, to also recognize some of the challenges that it's facing as it goes and embarks on these activities. I think that's kind of the other side of the picture. It's not just striding effortlessly toward global domination, but it faces some real challenges domestically, but also abroad as it goes into other countries and tries to do big, complicated projects. It sounds maybe not that controversial when I put it that way, but I think sometimes that's not the initial impression that people have when they look at China's global activities.
You're an interesting guy. You've got a lot of interesting experiences. I know you, by your background, you are very versed in diplomacy. You're probably very good at making sure that things stay somewhat neutral. But I feel, even though I'm not in the States at this moment, my pulse that there is a breakdown in the States. There's a trust breakdown. Each side, there's clearly two sides. Each side has their view and their opinion of the other side. It surely looks like, okay, you could say, well, America's had trials and tribulations before. But right now, and I don't know if it's a combination of because we've got the social media that's pumping everybody nonstop, so there's no time to relax and everyone's jacked up, but the trust seems to be on quicksand. And I probably could say that a lot stronger. Trust is breaking or has broken. How do you look at this? I really want to peel back the onion some here. And if you and I disagree, that's fine. If we agree, that's fine. And I might push you a little, you might push me, that's fine. But how do you feel about this right now?
I think you're speaking to something that has been, I think it's not new, but it's something that is maybe more, we see more of the negative impacts of it. I personally think that it makes it all the more important to seek out opportunities to talk with people on the quote unquote other side, or just people with different experiences and different perspectives, to try to have in your group of friends and acquaintances people who disagree with you on some things. I think one of the things that social media has done is to create these bubbles in which we're all living in our own carefully cultivated reality that's designed to either affirm the things that we believe and or to make us angry at people who aren't on the same page. It takes out that opportunity for listening and learning and more civil discourse. And so, I mean, look, I've enjoyed talking with you because you disagree with me on some of this stuff. I've appreciated that opportunity.
A great example right now as we look at this, in some ways, this is all connected because as far as we know, at least as what we have been told, that the virus originated inside China. 2 years later, here we are. We have America divided over something like the mandating of a vaccine. Take it or not take it. It's really interesting. I don't think you or I could have got a little bit of a political background myself. You can probably guess that by the way I'm bringing these things up with you. But it's really fascinating that within 2 years that America is at this point. I think everyone can see it. I try to analyze it from both sides, even though I definitely am on a side. This side of people that are like, hey, we've just got to do this vaccine. And the other side is like, well, hold on. What are the risks here? Let's try and quantify this. And it's terribly interesting how both sides, they're set. And in some ways, I can understand both sides, even if I don't agree with them.
I think, unfortunately, that there's been a decline in the degree to which some people are willing to, well, there's been a government trust issue, which is part of this, but then there's also, I think, a reluctance among some to actually believe science. And so maybe they're asking for data, but are they really? Or they just want to have an excuse not to do something because of that level of distrust.
Well, but America's got that little bit of a liberty thing. So if you say they just don't want to do it, well, yeah, someone's kind of got to make the position as to why they need to take it. And then someone like me, I look around, I look at the data. The data says the vast majority of people that are dying are, by medical clinical definition, morbidly obese. So if you're not morbidly obese, which a lot of young people are not yet in America, there's more of a rub there. So I get where you're coming from. There might be some people out there that are anti-vaxxer and they're not going to take the vaccination no matter what. But there's a lot of other people that are asking questions saying, well, hold on, what's the risk analysis here? If I don't take this vaccine, what are my chances of dying if I'm not obese, if I am obese? I mean, it gets into that level. And this is all where the trust thing comes. And you know, that it affects everything because then you and I are having a conversation about China and you can see where I'm coming from. I'm going to be the skeptic. I'm going to push back. It's right back to the trust thing, isn't it?
My initial reaction to the trends we see, at least in the US, is that the overwhelming number of people with really negatively severe health outcomes are unvaccinated. I think that's another critical point. I've got a young kid who's unvaccinated, who's not eligible to be vaccinated.
You got to move to California. They're going to get everyone there. My friend who is a liberal Democrat just told me she's now got to make the decision to take her kids out of the public schools because they're going to mandate it for every kid.
I think we've done this in the past for other public health reasons. I remember as a kid going to school and it was mandatory to be vaccinated for a whole bunch of things. In the numbers that we've looked at that we're seeing, that's a tragedy as the deaths continue to mount.
That's the trust thing. Okay, so if I understand your perspective, you're saying, hey, this is terrible. People could die. But do you go ahead?
Well, they are dying.
But do you go ahead, if we're in the middle of this thing, do you go ahead and then do the mandates and say, you're going to lose your job, you're going to get fired, and just put this accelerant on top of it? I mean, does that make sense?
Unfortunately, we didn't get there very quickly, but after the result of too much inaction. And so I think it's entirely fair to look at other incentives and mechanisms to get people vaccinated.
Do I make you uncomfortable? I'm serious.
What's it like where you are?
Vietnam has had trouble with it. I mean, they've gone down a path of trying to do lockdowns. And I don't think it's been successful. I don't think the lockdowns have been successful anywhere. I'll actually go with it for a second because you asked the question in the sense of you probably don't want me to hint about what I'm thinking about. I mean, to me, I look at the lockdowns around the world have most likely failed. Natural immunity is something that we have completely discounted. Obviously, millions, if not billions of people have some form of natural immunity. All the studies do say that it is a thing, regardless of the vax mandates. I think more than likely we're coming out of it now because of a combination of natural immunity and vaccines. But the scary part is around the world to watch all of the governments, this heavy-handed approach. It doesn't make me feel good. And this is why I thought it was really interesting to talk to you today, too, is that I think the QR code is coming to us all. I think we're all going to be faced with the QR code for who knows what. It's probably going to be more than vaccines. Is that an unreasonable thinking to have? Is that we're all going to be faced with QR codes for all kinds of whatever in the not too distant future?
I had coffee the other day with a former colleague who's Canadian. He was visiting from Canada and he showed me he had this digital pass on his phone it shows when he got his vaccination. Basically, he described it as something that's necessary for him to go about his daily life in Canada. It doesn't seem to me that Canada is becoming some authoritarian country because of that. I think that they have relatively high vaccination rates. The rates went up after they rolled out the use of that tool. And so there's probably a whole bunch of lessons to learn from other countries and not all of them negative.
If somebody has natural immunity and they're fired from their job because they won't take the vaccine, I think there's nothing else that I could call that except authoritarian. This is something we've known about infectious diseases for a long time. So I think that really is probably a great point for, like you and I, if we're sitting across from each other over coffee, you might just say, well, Mike, that's where the line in the sand is. And I might say, Jonathan, that's where the line in the sand is. And maybe that's where the line in the sand is. This is where all these subjects, and you're right in the middle of living them all. So you're completely comfortable with people like me. But where does this leave us if we've got these points where we can't get past them?
I'm an advocate of more information, more conversation. I think when it's something like a health crisis, there is some urgency. But on this broader trust question, I think we need to find ways to get out of our social media bubbles. Hopefully this conversation does that for a few people.
Well, very cool stuff. I really implore people to check the book out for sure. The Digital Silk Road, China's Quest to Wire the World and Win the Future. I would pepper you for hours. You know that. I would keep us going. You might go crazy, but I think it's terribly important because, listen, you see the programming out there. How many different places do you truly see the conversation that you and I have had over the last 50, 60 minutes? Really? Do you see it often?
No, it's been great. I'm happy to have the opportunity, and I appreciate you playing the role of the skeptic here. A lot of people, when they do public engagement, it is just kind of softball stuff, and so I appreciate.
They dial it in. You're like, oh, damn, he's not going to dial it in. Oh, my God. Well, cool stuff. Hey, where can we direct people to? Where would you like to send them? Is there a place to come check you out? Do you have a main website you want to send people to?
Just the site for the book, I think.
People can check the book out on Amazon and go find it. The Digital Silk Road, easy to find. Great name, actually. Is that yours or do you commandeer that?
That is the Chinese government's name for this broad set of activities.
Gotcha.
Amazon's great.
Hey, man, thanks for coming on. Thanks for coming into the, as they would have done in the old days with Bill Buckley, the firing line, so to speak.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash, or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.